Fascinating. So as I said to you, I'm thrilled with the junior faculty, actually now almost mid-career faculty that we've been able to recruit to Stanford in the last few years. Maybe all three of you can come up here and we'll take some questions now from the audience on any of the topics that you've seen. We do have microphones in the back, so if you maybe stick up your hand if you have a question and we'll get a microphone to you.
Question on the left.
Actually, there's one behind you, then we'll get to you. Okay.
Great stuff. This is fantastic, and I'm really enjoying it. And I'm just wondering, you have the most important senses, and they seem to be classifying them as individual senses. But are you also looking at computers, not the telerobotics, but the computers that are trying to understand in say, two domains, say vision and touch, or combining multiple? Is it hard enough with just one, or are you looking at combining multiples?
So who wants to take that?
Yeah, so to repeat the question, you're asking if we heard you, is that are people working on not only the one sensory system of vision or haptics, are we combining those? The answer is absolutely. I think the opportunity there is tremendous. You know, nature did build an integrated system, which is animals and us, to use these different sensory systems, and there are concrete collaborations going on at Stanford and elsewhere that combines different senses. And at least Chris Manning and I are collaborating, and
I collaborate with computer vision people as well. Just one quick comment is that on the neuroscience side, the understanding of both vision and touch, it's still very complicated individually, and there is sort of a new wave of neuroscientists now who are interested in cross-modal sensing and how the different senses interact. And a common trick we use in haptics to make a virtual wall feel stiffer is to just make it visually not deflect as much. So we borrow tricks from other senses in order to even enhance what people feel.
Great. There's a question. We cut you off, so we'll give you the next question here. So, is the microphone turned? Here comes the microphone.
Yeah.
Okay. The last talk I believe said that the computer machines still apparently have difficulty in understanding, yet the examples with the Google processing seem to indicate that Google gave the appropriate answers, whether or not it understood what it was doing. It seemed to act as though it understood the matter.
Yeah. So the question of what actually counts as understanding is, ultimately, is it one of these deep philosophical questions that is it sufficient if you just can give the right answers? Does that count as understanding, or how do you test for deeper understanding? But I mean, I'm going to give Google credit that in a lot of cases, why people love it is it behaves as a human would expect in giving you the information you need. But on the other hand, it's not very hard to exceed its natural language understanding abilities. If you start writing in some, thoughts and questions into the Google search box, I think you'll very quickly find that it doesn't understand you as well as your friends do.
Other questions? In the back here.
Are we more limited by computing power or algorithms?
Okay. I mean, I think we're actually more limited by algorithms. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, clearly what's allowing us to do a lot of the things that we can do today with big data and building large deep learning systems is that our computers have order of magnitude more speed and storage than they did a decade ago. I mean, so that is clearly helping. I mean, on the other hand, it was also the case that Bill Gates used to give talks about natural interfaces to computers in 1980, where he said, once our computers are 10 times faster, they'll be able to understand natural language. And simply making the computers 10 times faster did not solve all the problems of the world.
And just to comment on that, we have long passed the time that the speed of a transistor is way faster than speed of a neuron. So granted, we still have a lot of neurons in our brain, but if you consider all the machines in the Google farms or somewhere, we have a lot of hardwares. Of course, there's still a lot of room to improve, but I would agree with Chris as well. There's a lot of work to do on the algorithm side.
And I'll just briefly note that in my field, it's probably two things, which are not algorithms or computing speed, but rather hardware, actuation technology, as well as understanding the science of human sensing.
So it's computers and hardware and software and everything.
It's everything.
Yeah, in the world of being a laboratory scientist, there's a term consilience, which is operating in two different worlds, right, and getting an answer about a given problem from two different perspectives, and you bring them together, and you have a sort of a clash and an explosion of understanding. Right, and I'm struck by the fact that as I see you all talking, you've got to be talking to each other, and the crosstalk has to get even stronger.
Yeah.
Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, I think we agree with you. And I think, as Allison's research is definitely cross-disciplinary between the neuroscience and the human sensing and robotics. Myself, we work with neuroscientists, psychologists, HCI, NLP, and the opportunities are, I agree, are at the intersection.
There's certainly starting to be a lot of work now involving both language and vision, because to a large extent they're complementary. I mean, that's why you get pictures alongside the text. And so exploiting that complementary knowledge is very valuable.
I'm not sure who the question is for, and not even sure it can be understood by a human being anyway. I think it's for Chris, though, and that is, if you can simulate the activity of the brain and touching and all the other stuff, you can simulate problems. You may be able to simulate disease. Is there anything going on yet in your field which would be tied in with the analysis and formulation of diseases and their treatments? The answer could be no, but
Yeah, I think there's certainly work that goes on in trying to understand diseases in simulation. I think that's a little bit far from my area of expertise to really be able to comment on. Something that's closer to my area of expertise that we have been trying to work on is trying to understand biological processes from text descriptions of them, so that there are enormous amounts of knowledge about various areas of biology, medicine, treatments that are out there, and can we automatically do language understanding, right? There's this sort of really weird world at the moment in which, by and large, doctors write down clinical notes, and then some other less qualified human being transcribes them into a code for the insurance billing, right? And it'd be nice if more of the richness of language understanding could then be brought to bear in both, interpreting your problems and then finding solutions for them.
Let's see. How about right over here?
So what aspect of text knowledge has been solved by IBM's Watson, and what is your perspective on that? Because it definitely beats somebody who's human at that game. So what aspect of that problem has been solved, and what's remaining?
Some, but a lot not. So IBM Watson was clearly a very impressive feat. I mean, it got a bit of a head start by being able to press the buzzer quicker than a human being. That's the haptics bit. But nevertheless, that only worked because it pretty much knew the answer a lot of the time, and it knew when it was going to get the answer right. And so that was an impressive feat. That doesn't mean that all of the problems of natural language is solved. In particular, like many things that are great PR successes, there's quite a bit of work in finding the problem that will be the PR success. And one of the secrets with respect to Jeopardy is that it's a question with a unique answer that the question is looking for. So effectively, you just need to have a way of having the best answer trickle up. And it's not clear that that immediately generalizes to a lot of the problems that the attempt is now to apply Watson to, right? When you turn up at the doctor and you've got some pains in your arm and there's this funny coloring, that's not the same kind of thing as a Jeopardy question as to what is the answer.
Hi, this is a question for Chris Manning. And so have you done research on other languages other than English? And if so, what are the common findings that you have across multiple languages?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, what we get around to depends on various things. I mean, the main other languages we worked on are Chinese, French, German, and Arabic, actually. So there are certainly some huge differences. So, I mean, you know, some of the most dramatic ones are just writing system differences. So, you know, Arabic is written from right to left and leaves out the vowels, and Chinese has its rich ideographic characters, and then you need to do cutting things into words, right? A major development of Western civilization was putting spaces between words, right? That didn't actually used to exist in, like, ancient Greek is written by ancient Greeks. There were no spaces between words, right? That was an invention of the medieval monks to make it a bit easier. So and I mean, more subtly, there are big differences between languages and their structure. But on the other hand, there are also a ton of universals of language. And I mean, that's what's been developed and spelt out much more in modern linguistics, is showing that languages don't vary without bounds. And there are common elements of structure across all languages, where they have noun phrases with sort of nouns and modified. They get put together in clauses. There is a lot of common structure, and we attempt to exploit that in the systems we build.
Over here.
Yeah. This question is really for the vision and haptics people. We all like to understand things from simple and build them up to more complex understandings that satisfies us. But I was wondering whether, say, in haptics, what you feel might actually be very complex when you touch something, and whether you have to represent sensations as complex entities. And similarly in vision, you remember those generalized cylinders. Maybe you need, if you began with fairly complex fundamental representations, whether it'd be much easier to build an understanding system. I'm wondering what you thought about that.
I think that's an excellent point. So on the two sides of haptics research, I think on the side of sensing things that are complex and doing recognition, that's very feasible. And we've done work of that kind using tactile array sensors to capture lots of object information and then trying to match that, I guess, in a more computational way to models that we have of objects, and doing that, I guess, more holistically. On the side of actually displaying haptic information to people, we don't really have the luxury of building really complex systems. We start with the simple ones and build up. So there may be a top-down versus bottom-up approach depending on which way you're trying to display or get haptic information.
Yeah, and also just to add, this word Allison just used, top-down and bottom-up. This kind of representation also exists in vision. One very important fact of our human brain, there is 10 times as much feedback connections from the end stage, like prefrontal cortex of the brain, back to the early processing area. There's 10 times as much connections as the feed-forward connections. So this really points to the fact that intelligent machineries like the brain takes a lot of feedback and top-down information into account when it tries to integrate information. So definitely in computer vision, we also tries to model that into our models.
You back here?
Back to the IBM Watson experiment. Would you care to conjecture what would have happened if they would have shown photos or pictures, let's say of a city or a scene from a movie, and asked the computer what that was?
So the IBM Watson, as I understand, took 30 engineers several years to put together that system. I think first IBM has to hire a different set of 30 engineers, mostly with degrees from computer vision instead of NLP. So the short answer to this is that we're making progress. For example, there are applications. They're not in the form of IBM Watson, but applications by major companies, including Google, Facebook, where you give a picture and it recognizes places and people, especially landmark places like Golden Gate Bridge and Eiffel Tower. Some Google applications can actually recognize it. If you give it to a computer, a generic picture, even just a picture of this room, and ask it to tell a story and describe the scene, we're not there yet.
Maybe one or two more. I'm up right here.
Thank you. That was great. Just a general question to all of you. Given the state of each of those fields, how far do you think are we from a combination of this to what has been referred to as a singularity? When do you think artificial intelligence would come to a point where you would essentially, as a whole, all of these technologies could be put together into an entity that can compete with the human?
That's such a generic question, right?
Well, maybe I can give my own twist on that for haptics. This is not an artificial intelligence field, but if I were to say it's the perfect haptic virtual environment, would be one where if you're a Star Trek fan, you go into the holodeck and it's a virtual world that seems completely real. All the things they do in this holodeck would require haptic interaction and visual displays that seem completely real. And at the moment, we are nowhere near to passing a haptic Turing test, right? The famous Turing test, can you tell the difference between a computer and a person? You could say that I think we're many decades away, at least in haptics, from being able to display a completely foolproof, realistic virtual world.
I'd give the same answer. It seems like the early history of artificial intelligence is littered with people saying that in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years that we'd have computers that are more intelligent than us. I think what we're actually going to have happen in the space of decades is we are going to have computers that are better than us in certain narrow domains. To some extent that's already true, but the space in which that is true will become larger, that there'll be more general areas of competence where the computers can actually do more and understand more than we can. But I think it is still just a very, very long way away before we're likely to have computers or robots that have the full broad range of competencies and adaptability that a human being does.
So just add to Chris, sorry. To give a little more optimistic outlook, I actually agree with Alison and Chris, but I do believe this is a very special era for AI in a sense that I think we're at the cusp of a change. I'm not saying the change is directly to replicating everything an integrated human being can do, but the time has. We're going through a very interesting transition. I think the last 50, 60 years of AI, we have laid a lot of foundations, mathematical foundations. We looked at fundamental problems of representation, inferences, learning. And I think this new era with ubiquitous sensing devices, big data, and computing power, all these in a way, external forces to AI itself has been changing the way our field is working, and I think working in this area, I personally feel it's a very exciting phase transition, I would call it, period.
Yeah, I just had a question for Fei-Fei. In machine vision, hasn't color been very important to the difference between humans and the rest of the human being, living items in the world, the ability to distinguish color?
Yes, okay. The question is color important? First of all, yes, color is very important. But there are many interesting facts about color. First of all, humans are probably the fewer animals that see more colors than most animals. I'm not saying that we see the most colors, but colors, we see richer colors than many animals. Second, if you look at the neuroscience and the processing of visual signals that are rods and cones, let me get this right. The rods process the intensity and the cones process color, and the intensity information that that actually travels to the other parts of your brain somewhat slightly faster than the color information. So the very first sweeping wave of neuronal spikes that goes through your visual process and reach to your higher area of the brain come mostly from intensity. So this is not to say color is not important, but this is to say that we can do a lot without color. Having said that, in computer vision, we are taking into account of all sorts of information, and color is part of it.
Well, let's take one more question.
Hi, so we talk about knowledge a lot. I wonder what is the best way to describe the world, because there is images, there is text, languages, and there is concept, and there's fact, and then there's knowledge. And if you think about language or text as symbols, and concepts as like things that mean something, like one object or concept, and then facts as relationship and association between concepts, and knowledge are common facts or shareable or transferable facts, or that common to a lot of things. So if we understand the world, describe the world this way, we can extract concept, facts, and knowledge from image or text or symbols or a lot of things. So does that make sense, or is that?
Yeah, that sort of makes sense. I mean, I think the truth is that working out the best ways to do this is still a work in progress. But I mean, to offer a couple of thoughts on that, I mean, thought one is, I think the representation of knowledge is in some sense going to be multimodal as well, so that there are some kinds of knowledge which you want to represent in a model of understanding spatial relationships and actually lay them out in your head, right? Your brain can see pictures and scenes. And, you know, taking something that makes sense to think about as a 3D layout and then trying to turn it into a pile of statements of predicate logic does not make it more comprehensible. And so I think we're going to want to have that in as well. Then there are lots of other kinds of knowledge which are well represented as having relations. But one of the interesting things there, I think, is that a lot of our relations that human beings work with are more flexible and fluid than the kind of relations that our automatic reasoning systems have traditionally worked with. I'll just give you one random example of that. I sort of remember a problem with a system a few years ago, and the sentence was about Brazil's ambassador to FIFA, and the conventional knowledge representation system couldn't cope with this because, as far as it was concerned, only countries had ambassadors.
Yeah, good. Well, we have a reception out back with some food and drink that we would love to have you attend and catch up with old friends. But before we do that, let's please thank Chris and Allison and Fei-Fei.